Hey, what's going on, everybody? So recently in my quiet time, I've been reading some passages from the Old Testament, and a couple weeks back I started in 1 Samuel, and now I've kind of bumped up into 2 Samuel. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, there's a really interesting story, kind of a conversation, a back and forth that happens between King David, Nathan the prophet, and God gets involved, and there's this really interesting conversation that just goes back and forth. I want to read some of that for you and what I heard God say in this part of 2 Samuel chapter 7. Just going to start reading in verse 1. When the king had settled into his palace, that's David, and the Lord had given him rest on every side from all his enemies, the king said to the prophet Nathan, "Look, I'm living in a cedar house while the ark of God sits inside tent curtains." So Nathan told the king, "Go and do all that is on your mind, for the Lord is with you." Verse 4 says, "But that night," that's a problem. We're about to change direction. "But that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan. Go to my servant David and say, 'This is what the Lord says. Are you to build me a house to dwell in? From the time I brought the Israelites out of Egypt until today, I have not dwelt in a house. Instead, I have been moving around with a tent as my dwelling. In all my journeys with all the Israelites, have I ever spoken a word to one of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, asking, 'Why haven't you built me a house of cedar?'" Now, here's what's happening. David has peace with all of his enemies. He's got time to think, and he decides, if I live in a really nice palace, I need to build God a really nice house as well. He shouldn't be outside in the tent. And so I'm going to build him a palace, a temple. And Nathan says, yeah, go and do everything that is in your heart. God is with you. Nathan doesn't consult God on it either. And then God shows up in verse 4 to Nathan and says, "I didn't ask for that." All the way down, verses 5, 6, and 7, God says to Nathan, "Tell David, not once in all my time leading the people of Israel have I ever asked for a house. Have I ever asked for a house of cedar, a temple? Not once. That's not what I asked you to do." Now, was David's thought about building God a temple a bad thought? A bad thing? No, of course not. It wasn't bad. It wasn't bad to have a temple or a nice place for the Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God, to dwell. That's not a bad thing. It's just that God had more important things for David to keep his mind and his heart focused on. So, for instance, it's really easy for us to get caught up in a lot of good things to do. There's a lot of good causes, good organizations to support. There's a lot of good things that can be done in the world. Volunteering at a puppy shelter is a good thing to do. That's great. You can do that. You can do lots of good things, but don't forget the most important thing that God is asking you to do. Don't substitute those other nice, good things for the most important things that God is calling you to do. And one of those things that we know is to go and make disciples. All authority has been given to Jesus, he says in Matthew 28, verse 18. And then in verse 19, Jesus says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations." One thing we know that we are supposed to be on mission for and a part of a cause for and a reason to move forward is the Great Commission to make disciples of all nations. Along the way, there's a lot of other good things to be a part of, but don't ever substitute the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations. Don't ever replace that with the other good things that there are to do. Approach God. Here's a practical thing to do. When you go and approach God in prayer, this is what I want you to do. I want you to practice some listening prayer. Just ask God in your prayer, "God, what is it you would have of me? What's the most important thing I can do with my day? What's the most important thing I can do with my time?" When God begins to give you the names of neighbors and friends and coworkers around you who you should pray for or who need to know Jesus, now is the opportunity and the moment for you to begin to pray for those people, to walk into the mission of God to make disciples. So now we start praying for people by name. We start engaging them in the conversation. But when you go to God in prayer, practice listening and saying, God, what is it you would have of me? What's the most important thing I can do today? Yes, there's a lot of good things to do. There's a lot of good causes to be a part of and organizations to support and stuff to do. But God, I want to hear from you. What's the most important thing I can do with my day, with my time, with my week? God, give me a name, someone to share you with, someone to pray for. God, keep me on track with the most important mission on planet Earth. Help me to be there to make disciples and not get distracted by all the other good things that are going on around me. If you ever feel like your priorities are kind of wrestling and getting, in conflict with each other a little bit, 2 Samuel 7 is a great place to go. And remember that David wanted to do something great for God, something good for God, but God still had that part of him that said, that's not the most important thing. So reorient your heart and your mind and your passion, your soul, on the most important thing God would have of you. Ask him what it is. Begin to pray for people by name and move toward making disciples of all nations. Hope this encourages you to keep your priorities on the most important thing that God would have of you.